Greetings. Hi, I'm Dr. Kamal Kokai, and I'm your presenter this day in talking about the coronavirus. And I'm talking to you both as an elder, as a physician, and also as a holistic healer. And I think it's important to look at this virus through a number of different lenses if we have a chance to get back into balance so that this is not going to be the type of problem that faces humanity going forward. Right, there we go. I'm calling this from mushroom clouds to hidden microbes because behind this is mankind. Man is the problem. Man is the manipulator of the technology, right, that leads to destruction. And man is at a level of consciousness that really still sees himself as somehow man against other men, right? Man against nature. And none of that is going to work at this point. So in working at other levels of energy matter organization, whether we're at the atomic level, whether we're working with viruses, bacteria, right? We're using this technology in a way that is actually harmful, potentially harmful, and that's the problem. That is the main problem. So just to get oriented, so again, we're talking about a viral pandemic, and because it's a pandemic, it's something that affects everybody. So, and that has important implications as we kind of go into this. But I realize that people confuse viruses with bacteria, with parasites. I always hear people talking about, parasites when they're really talking about worms, or talking about herbs when they're really talking about homeopathy. So we're going to take a minute for a quick review.
Welcome to Life Noggin. Viruses are one of the earliest forms of life as we know it. They're little strings of genetic material called RNA, coated in a protein jacket. They've evolved to make people sick in very specific ways. They hijack cells and use the cells to produce more viruses. Once the virus is ready, it can force its host to share it with others. For example, the varicella zoster virus, VZV, causes little red spots to appear all over the infected person. We call them chickenpox. They are very, very itchy, and the virus did that on purpose. It fills the pox with more viruses, so when people scratch them, they let the virus out of their body, spreading it to people nearby. It's actually pretty smart. In an evil way. And this is how lots of viruses move through the population. They get inside a body, and then after a few days, or sometimes years, they'll try and hitch a ride to another body. The time from when they get inside a person to when they try and spread is called the incubation period. During that time, the virus is invading cells and fighting the immune system. During the incubation period, if you have a virus, you might not even notice. Chickenpox can take weeks before the first pox appear. The flu, another common virus, is less patient. Its incubation period is only half of a day. It really wants to get out into the world again. The flu spreads so fast through your friends because it can spread so fast in your body too. The influenza virus evolved to make you cough and sneeze so it can hitch a ride on the tiny droplets of water that come out when you do so. Let's say Ian has the flu and coughs. Then Pat inhales a few droplets later. Once inside his body, the influenza virus hopes to hit an epithelial cell. Epithelial cells line the airway and are the perfect place for a new flu virus to set up shop. Once it finds the right cell, it has to get inside. But cells don't just let anyone off the street inside their membranes. So to convince the cell to let it in, viruses have little bumps on the outside of their jacket called receptors. Receptors are like keys, and if the virus has the right key, our cell will surround it, called endocytosis. This can happen less than 10 minutes after the flu droplet is inhaled. Once inside the cell, the influenza takes off its jacket, and it transforms. From there, the little bit of genetic RNA material heads to the nucleus of the cell, and it does something called cap snatching. It steals a cap from the host's RNA molecules and puts it on itself. Once wearing the cap, the flu virus can trick the DNA in the nucleus to make more pure flu virus, again and again and again. As more and more virus fills up the cytoplasm, the new guys steal bits of the cell's outer membrane to put on a jacket and head out into the body. Even though the influenza virus invades human cells really quickly, it can take a day or two before you'll feel sick. The immune system is on the prowl looking for infected cells and any virus in your bloodstream. It's a huge battle. If you have a fever or feel sore and achy, that's a side effect of your immune system attacking an infection. Fevers change the body's temperature to try and slow the virus down. The achiness comes from our own body trying to help the immune system cells fight the infection. After a few days, the immune system usually wins out, but chances are you've already spread the virus to someone else. Sorry. In the end, viruses aren't trying to hurt us. They're just fighting to survive. I want to take a minute to thank our...
And I want to say something about that, the idea that viruses are really just trying to survive. In biology, viruses aren't considered to be alive, but viruses are created. They're created like thoughts, like any other thing that appears within human consciousness. It had to come from somewhere. And of course, that's a big question with this virus. But the point is, it's funny, in my meditation group, someone presented to me that when she actually talked to the virus, she said, "What is it that you want? What are you trying to do?" The virus said, "I just want to live." And then I had, through sharing with another practitioner, told me that a patient said that when the virus entered, she felt like it was just a intelligent missile that was just looking for a weak point, trying to get in. So while these are seemingly metaphysical conceptions, but the key here is that the virus knows what it's doing. You know, it's doing it quite well. It's quite sophisticated. But again, we come back to the problem that man has in terms of the level of growth. And that level of growth constantly pits man against himself. It puts man, and we educate and we train ourselves to compete. We train ourselves to put ourselves in a position to have authority and control over other people. And it's not going to work. And that same attitude gives rise to this energy here. So, in showing you that, that's a type of man, right? And at present, when we think of human beings, we all have our different filters, whether it's race, gender, religion, culture, nation state. But these filters have to really fall to the side because we're in a pandemic. The pandemic is in part here because it helps people to get past their particular limitations. And if you don't, you can get crushed by it. You can get crushed by the fear and anxiety and all the other things that come up. So it's important that we move beyond whatever sphere that we're functioning in and realize we're dealing with something that has much larger implications. So this is a scale of consciousness that looks at consciousness through these actually relate to this, in some ways, the 7 chakras with the different color schemes, the 7 chakras of the Hindu system. But the point here is that the level of consciousness, vibration, we really have to get up above 250 here if we're going to have a chance to really come up with the kind of solutions that benefit everybody as well as the planet. It takes a different kind of informed leadership, a leadership that's more informed by spirit than their own particular needs of themselves or any one group. And that's really key. And again, if you think about this virus, the human being, our cells, there's the order of magnitude of the other kind of earthbound creatures, parasites, fungi, and viruses that live in a healthy human body outnumber human cells by hundreds. Just viruses alone, that there are 10 times more viruses than healthy human cells. So this isn't going to be a thing where we come up with something just to destroy a virus. It's about being in balance. And to be in balance requires a certain level of consciousness in actually approaching that. So then when we start looking at the virus itself, right? So the virus wants to live. The virus has been created, whether in nature or in a laboratory. But the point is, it's here. And this virus seems to be very good at infiltrating into the human cells. And I'm going to talk about the 2 diseases that it really reminds me of when I look at how it works. But for now, we know that the virus works through these different receptors, the ACE2 receptors. You see the CD147 receptors in the T in your lymphocytes, and of course, the little video talked about endocytosis as the virus actually gets into the cell, right? But here we have a picture of cells at various levels of infiltration. So on the left, you have the healthy cells with the epithelial lining, the outer lining intact. You see the immune cells, the T cells, they're primed, they're ready to go. And then all of a sudden, some of the virus, I guess it attaches to that ACE2 receptor and it gets in, and you can begin to see the immune system mobilizes. You have what are called cytokines. There are at least 37 of them, at least discovered right now. And I tell you, these didn't even exist when I was in medical school. So, but what happens, different cytokines are released and they're activated. But part of what they do is they actually create problems for the T cells. You notice your T cells get diminished because in the process of the cytokines reacting and the virus damaging the cell, we have a process that leads to decreased oxygen. Decreased oxygen leads to something called aerobic glycolysis and formation of something you're probably familiar with called lactic acid. And that lactic acid really diminishes and paralyzes your cell-mediated immunity. And let me just go back to that picture, because on the right, you have now with hardly any lymphocytes totally diminished. What you have now are all of these cytokines, which cause capillary leakage and inflammation, which in themselves can actually kill a person, as we've heard. So if you think about this, the virus gets into the lung cell or any cell, but particularly in the lungs because it leads to destruction of connective tissue and fibrosis. And in the webinar that's upcoming, we're going to talk about botanicals and other things that help prevent this post-COVID-19 reaction, because there's still many people, they've gotten sick, and weeks later they're still having difficulty really breathing. And that's for a number of factors, not just the cytokine piece that affects the immune system, but in that second picture, there was something called TNF, which you see on the bottom right here, tumor necrosis factor alpha, which actually leads to damage of the blood vessel walls, causing inflammation, causing what's called a vasculitis, right? And we're now hearing about something in pediatrics called multi-system disease, because there's a whole vascular problem that's causing clot formation. So that leads to thromboses, and whether it's, coronary arteries, as in Kawasaki's, and just people that are actually having problems with their lungs, all of that discussion about high altitude sickness had a lot to do with the fact that, the alveoli, the lung sacs were still functioning, but it was the microscopic clotting that was taking place in the small blood vessels that's there that, is taking up the oxygen from the alveoli, and those were getting blocked. And that, of course, is a major problem. But this is the nature of this disease is twofold. One, it's destroying immune cells. When I start talking about T cells, maybe that reminds you of HIV, right? HIV, your T4 cells will diminish. In this disease, your T4, your T8, your natural killer cells diminish and is aerosolized. And then to top that off, it also reminds me of diabetes in the way that diabetes erodes and affects the vascular tree, causing like inflammation of the endothelial lining of the blood vessel, which leads to so many problems with diabetes, whether it's in the brain for stroke, heart, eyes, kidneys, but likewise with SARS-CoV-2, you have the similar pattern of this blood vessel inflammation. So you're having disease processes that resemble other things like Kawasaki's. So the presentation, depending on what part of the body is affected, can vary. But if you understand that, one, there's a problem with the immune system functioning. Two, which can lead to capillary leakage and the kind of inflammation. And then the second part is that there's inflammation of the blood vessels, which creates major problems in people of all ages. So that's kind of what we're facing with. And even like with the skin, even think about it. Some people get frostbite or frostbite-like symptomatology. Again, it's due to the blood vessels actually being affected, right? Now, I do want to just take a minute to think about, well, how do we get to this point where we have such a virulent virus when, back with SARS and MERS in 2003, and then later with MERS, we understood that coronaviruses could be a problem, but researchers were doing what's called gain of function research. And I don't know exactly when this started, but I do know that there was a moratorium put on it in 2014. But that moratorium didn't stop the work being done, particularly on a coronavirus, COVID-14, which was a cross between a bat and a mouse in terms of genetic material. And that was done in a laboratory. And of course, this present virus doesn't exactly resemble that. And that's been pointed out by people, that are really concerned about it. But you have all this clipping and snipping and virologists looking to say, well, we need to know how to fight these viruses if they did take a turn, but we're also risking that happening by creating these viruses which are very hard to contain. Very hard to contain. And you have all of this, and you even have virologists saying that it was impossible for us to do this, because the technology is not there. But this technology is out there. This gene therapy, you can practically make a virus from scrap without there being any kind of blueprint on it. It create all kinds of problems. So could man possibly have done this? Well, in nature on the right here, I'll tell you, this is just a quote for something else that was done. They wanted to bypass natural selection and plug in a gene that would mushroom through the population faster than a mutation handed down by the usual process of inheritance. So again, we're thinking that we can just jump in at these other levels of energy matter organization and have such control and proficiency that we can control outcomes with this. So somebody has a giant ego. And, there were scientists that really protested this gain of function research. That's why there was a moratorium. But apparently that's continued. So who knows what else is actually out there? And it's very interesting when you look at COVID-19 and the genome, you see little pieces from any number of sources. And you're wondering, well, how did all of this happen? That these viruses just kind of meet up and exchange parts? So again, but the point is that one other point here is the mutations that are taking place. Yesterday, reading a journal article that mutations are actually taking place within an individual, right? Meaning, and not just mutations where, it doesn't change anything, but mutations that actually affects the pathogenesis, the pathology. So like the whole piece with the vascular expression, the vascularized expression of the virus, we see that happening more and more. And you just wonder, as more people get infected, as more mutations happening, what's actually down the road. At the point that I was pulling research, this is just dealing with the fact that there are different strains of the virus that are around the world. But I'm now talking about viruses just changing, within just smaller segments of the population, within people. So not clear where that's going to go. The other thing that's come up that I had to address, I remember when HIV came out, I couldn't believe that all these people in Africa were dying until I actually spent time in South Africa and was at the hospital. I said, wow, this is actually happening here. And it's the same thing with this virus. I've heard a lot of people that scientists, doctors that have focused on the larger picture with respect to pollution and the fact that people die from the flu every year. And, not that many people are really dying. Yet I know in my community, I know of people, somebody. If you're in New York, somebody that's passed away. Within one person, there's a connection, and somebody's actually died. This excess mortality data just looks at people that are dying, on an everyday basis over, just a historical average. And you see the red is signifying what's happening here. It looks like these are all like around March. You just see this uptake around the world. You have more people dying. Now, is it from COVID-19? Maybe not, but maybe the person didn't want to go to the hospital. Maybe, there was something else that was going on, and maybe it wasn't COVID-19, but indirectly, if you look at the deaths that are taking place, right, you have to relate it to this viral activity in some way, shape, or form. It's just all these people just didn't decide to die. And, you know, this takes into account looking at flus. This is going beyond that. And so then we have health solutions, well, clear public health messaging. Well, certainly in the United States, that's kind of been a mess. You know, at least, you know, people have the whole thing, you know, about masks. There's even controversy around that. But you don't want to use antibacterial soap and just knock out your just general immunity to natural bacteria and things that are on your hands. But people do know about hand washing. But beyond the general public health guidelines, in terms of social distancing, there are no real larger solutions that are coming up. And the other thing that's most disturbing to me as a doctor is that we don't have non-pharmaceutical evidence-based therapy that's being presented to the public. You know, it's basically presented on the side, like the intravenous vitamin C that was used in sepsis successfully in China, so it was used here. But yet this is something that's been used for, I've used my whole practice, and at least over the last 50 years, there's evidence to show that this is useful. But again, it's not a pharmaceutical. It's not big money in it. So then the whole question arises about adequate health care. And adequate health care really has to move beyond just basic allopathic medicine. It has to embrace the larger we have to go from biochemistry to biophysics and begin to understand the human body, the human being, as a huge energy field, because the atom itself is empty space. So our senses give us the illusion that we're actually solid. And we really have to, yes, there's an aspect of that, but we have to look at the role that by energetic frequencies and just the advances in that, how those frequencies are actually affecting human health. And when we go to therapeutics, so if we start off with vaccine research, hey, guess what? So much controversy over the years in terms of the role that vaccines actually play in helping the human population, from, you know, the complaints and accusations and just actual documentation out of Africa, how in vaccines you find things that will actually sterilize women. In this country, there's a whole, there's a vaccine fund that's giving out billions of dollars. And as many patients that have come in swearing that their children have been affected by vaccines, they're not really listened to too well by mainstream medicine. And the whole notion that vaccines can be dangerous has somehow been dispelled when you look at the actual ingredients in vaccines and you realize that they're being injected into, babies that have no way to counter that invasion, and that's stuff that wouldn't be tolerated relative to what people do on a macro level to children, because they don't have a way to defend themselves. Yet we're willing to inject any manner of chemicals into a child's body, not once, but repeatedly, 20, 30 times over the first few years. Well, guess what? There's going to be a problem. Is there any promise in vaccines? Of course. But the problem is that there have been so many reactions to vaccines. So whatever it is that's been done, we really need to review and figure out a better way to do this. But, I'm not even saying that I'm anti-vaccine, but I'm saying what's being done now doesn't make any sense. And a lot of it is just motivated by money. So beyond that, of course, look at all the vaccines that are in the works now. Look at all the billions of dollars that are being put to come up with a vaccine for COVID-19. But to approach viruses in that way, I don't think that's necessarily going to work with this kind of virus. I think that technology is a little bit outdated for what we're being faced with now and the way the virus is actually changing. So if we, even beyond viruses, if we just look at allopathic drugs, is ivermectin, which is already an FDA-approved drug for the treatment of parasitic infections, but it turns out it's a potent inhibitor of the COVID-19 virus, and in a single treatment is able to affect a 5,000-fold reduction in the virus at 48 hours in cell culture. And this other drug that President Trump has actually let everyone know that, hey, I'm taking this. I had to laugh. I can see people having a fit, but people that know understand that hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, these are antivirals that at any time where they would be useful would be prophylactically, which is happening. Some countries are using it that way, or at the very beginning of illness. Once the virus is multiplied and busted out of cells and it's all over your body, and people on ventilators, this isn't going to help. So the problem is a lot of studies are being designed in a way to make this drug look like it's not going to do anything. In 2005, virologists were singing praises about hydroxychloroquine relative to its use with coronavirus and how it would be really useful. And then now, I mean, some of the studies being designed don't make any sense. Maybe you remember protease inhibitors. Back in the day when we were treating HIV and they were recycling these toxic chemotherapeutic drugs, people were dropping like flies. And it wasn't to the protease inhibitors that actually blocked the virus's ability, to actually get into the whole genome of the cell. And all of a sudden, these were working. And I remember the first person I had, she was really sick. And she was going to try the protease inhibitors. And it worked for her. And she went on to get her PhD and is still alive. And it just really, that was life-saving. But guess what? If we come down here, we see all of these these herbal compounds. These are Chinese herbs that have all had documented protease inhibiting effects on SARS, on a COVID virus. I mean, these things have been studied. They actually work, but we're not hearing about them. We'll come back to that a little bit later. There's some drugs that you shouldn't use. There's studies showing that benzodiazepines can be a problem, in precipitating illness, as well as NSAIDs, which they block prostaglandins, which make the cells more susceptible just to being infected with the virus because it's blocking some of the cellular protection. So that's not going to work. And then, of course, there are dead man walking drugs that make you better for a week or two, but really don't change the course of your illness. And, we think of a lot of chemotherapy drugs like this, and, we tend to jump to these really toxic drugs right off to see if they'll work. And they might work for a minute, but that can become a problem. And it's just not the kind of, all of us have watched these pharmaceutical advertisements on TV and was like, well, who the hell would take that medication and run the risk of all these things happening? It doesn't make sense. Then there's my area, which is really natural therapeutics. And here we have a lot of choices and options for different stages of the illness. So right off, people should be, from a public health standpoint, especially with quarantines being lifted and people being out there, people should be aware of what they can do with these these supplements, right? Vitamin C. Again, vitamin C is useful in that whole prevention of lactic acid. There was research done last year. Someone won a Nobel Prize talking about how these certain chemicals can will end up increasing this glycolysis that leads to the lactic acid production, which then depresses T cell immunity, prevents your T cells from being programmed. Vitamin C helps with that. Vitamin C helps with vascular injury, and it's an antioxidant, helps with inflammation in general. Vitamin C is key, and guess what? People that know it's really hard to get some good vitamin C right now, I recommend up to 5,000 milligrams a day in divided doses. Vitamin D3 is my other favorite in terms of the immune system because of all the things that it does at different levels. Vitamin D3 has been shown to reduce the risk of the seasonal influenza that takes place. Vitamin D3 is so important for innate immunity, the initial actions of the macrophages, these cells that engulf, bacteria, viruses, and things. Vitamin D3 is crucial, right? And even articles that supplementation reduces risk of influenza and COVID-19 infections and deaths. People that are dark complexion skin that tend to have lower vitamin D3 levels then, of course, are going to be at more risk and need to be taking supplementation. Selenium and the next one, zinc, are also important in viral and antiviral functioning. In my office, I carry around a vitamin C spray with zinc, and I give myself a shot every couple of patients. And zinc has also been shown to be crucial in the functioning of hydroxychloroquine. I believe Trump is actually taking zinc and hydroxychloroquine, and they work well together, and is also looking at azithromycin. It's interesting that all the literature with zinc and hydroxychloroquine, the information is out there, but and so I don't even think zinc's being included in these studies, and these things actually work together. And it's something I'll be talking about in the upcoming webinar. N-acetylcysteine is a mucolytic agent. It helps to break down mucus, right? It helps to support the lungs. And again, it's really crucial. It's an antioxidant, and anybody that I think is at risk for any kind of respiratory compromise from the virus, I'm recommending NAC up to 2,000 milligrams a day. The next two supplements, melatonin. Melatonin is just awesome relative to its antiviral effects, to its suppressing the cytokine storm, to helping people to get more rest that they actually need. But, even in, as an anti-cancer agent, it's a lot of research, and it's even been proposed in the medical literature that melatonin be used as a prophylactic with this virus. And I love this resveratrol, and remember that from grapes, because not only does it have an antiviral effect, it also helps to protect the lining of blood vessels, right? Meaning that whole vasculitis and the clots and things that form, resveratrol is really useful in blocking that. So again, that's something that I recommend just about everybody that I think needs some antiviral activity. Now you have these things. Japanese knotwood, Emodin. If you just Google Emodin and look at its effect, here it is. It's shown to actually help block that connection to the ACE2 receptor that is known that the COVID-19 really likes. And it's dose dependent, meaning you want to take more. There should be more studies done on this particular herb, but a lot of information about how it works. And again, we don't hear about Japanese knotwood, right? We also don't hear about astragalus. Astragalus in Chinese medicine is known as huang qi, and it helps to increase wei qi, which is protective or defensive energy. And if you look at it, if you remember the slide I had where the SARS virus is getting into the cell, and we saw activation of the immune system. We saw TNF alpha, interleukin 6, interleukin 10. Well, guess what? Astragalus helps to reduce that. It helps to keep that in check. But at the same time, it also has besides immune modulating activities, it also really helps to bolster the immune system, and it is a key herb, in a preventive fashion. It should really be used in early illness. Licorice root also in vitro, though, in the lab, it inhibits the SARS coronavirus, right? It's an earlier version of COVID-19. More research needs to be done. In Chinese medicine, licorice is very important as a guide herb, as an herb that helps to get, other herbs into the body. We'll say something about that in a minute. This is one of my favorite because it blocks the production of lactic acid in the body. It's one of the three yellows in Chinese medicine, both anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial. And there's also been a lot of research, in terms of its antiviral activity. And again, this is something that people should know about. People probably may recognize the name Scutellaria, but bicalin is key in helping folks. And then there's elderberry. And what's interesting with elderberry is that different types of elderberry work on different strains of viruses. And I haven't researched which one seems to be useful specifically for COVID-19, but again, elderberry is antiviral in general, so it's something that I regularly recommend for folks. Now, traditional Chinese medicine is huge because they have been fighting epidemics for 2,000 years, going back to one of these first Chinese medical texts is Shanhan Lun, cold-induced illnesses, and the author had lost family and friends to, cold. So viruses were understood relative to elements. Illnesses understood relative to elements in nature. You have when cold, you have when heat. But also now you have doctors beginning to look at the properties of Chinese herbs themselves. So on the one hand, you have any number of formulations, and again, with the recent experience going back to SARS, there is so much documentation in Chinese medicine. These are different formulas that are used at different stages of the illness, and these are basically things that we learn in Chinese, traditional Chinese medical training in school. And these things are readily available. And of course, then there are things that actually block, they inhibit replication of the SARS virus. And, there are a lot of research studies that really document this. These are some of the herbs I just talked about before, but there's a Japanese knotwood, the emodin. There's a bicalin again. I can't say enough about the power of these herbs. And of course, the Chinese have reported, it's funny because different provinces or hospitals will have their own formulations, their own things that they've put together, and they're able to demonstrate the efficacy. So homeopathy is in a class of its own because when we start talking about homeopathy, we're talking about bioenergetic medicine. And I want to point out that homeopathy has really about the best track record with respect to epidemics and pandemics historically. And this has been documented in the late 1990s. There's meningitis in Brazil. I believe homeopathy was really useful there. I've made a couple of other notes here on the right there was a cholera and a malignant diphtheria epidemic. Homeopathy it's a serious art form because it takes a different kind of understanding and appreciation of a patient. Let me go back to this slide right here. So believe it or not, homeopathy, look at the survival rate. And this is treating people during the Great pandemic back 100 years ago, right? 99% survival, 94% survival. And what homeopaths do is come up with the genus epidemicus, which will identify the main 3 or 4 remedies that present in terms of the pattern of illness. And this is something we'll talk about more in the next webinar, getting into specific remedies for different patterns, getting into specific botanicals for different clinical presentations. And this here should actually be its own slide, making peace with other kingdoms. And I say it that way because we're constantly in battle, right? Inhumane treatment to animals. You look at species that are no longer here. You just look at how we deal with the environment, the rainforest. I mean, you can go on and on. It's a problem, and again, it has to do with man's level of consciousness. That has to change, because in the same way that we don't respect one another, we find that making peace with other kingdoms, we don't even look at them as worthy of consideration. So that is going to be a major problem going forward, because the world is just too small at this point, and we all have to live together. Bioenergetic therapies. I mean, I wrote my thesis on physics, acupuncture, and medicine, and I'm sure there's specific frequencies and ways to interface with the body that are non-chemical, but at the same time will have chemical effects. And I'm sure that research is being done, and we'll see presentations of that in the near future. And so now if we talk about where do we go from here? Well, stabilization of the human emotional body of the planet. There have been moments that have been surreal for me, both walking streets in Los Angeles as well as here in New York, because it reminded me something from one of these zombie apocalypse movies, just in terms of the whole desolation of energy, and then just the whole emotional piece that everyone is going through with all of this loss taking place. Well, that on an individual level, that vibrational field, as your consciousness begins to close in, and there's all this fear and anxiety, that of course affects your immune system. That actually makes you more susceptible. So the media could actually be useful in terms of just setting up meditation, prayer vigils. I mean, we really need to have an uplifting kind of energy, and this needs to happen in the context of a number of other things that will give people confidence. Because right now we see leadership, people just at war and tearing each other down in different factions. You know, it's a mess. It's just a mess. This is not, and it doesn't inspire any confidence, and it makes people more fearful and more closed off. And again, the whole, like all this money that's being put into vaccines, I mean, who's going to pay for that? You know, and there just can't be a huge profit thing for people just being able to have the kind of health care that they need. Something has to change on that level. And what we have now does not work, and the infighting has to do with people protecting their interests, people protecting their financial interests, people protecting corporations now that have more rights than people. And then, of course, you have the experience of other medical systems. I mean, who is waiting on the United States to develop a vaccine? My assistant can't even leave to go back to her home country because they don't want anybody coming from this country right now, given, you know, the level of infection here and how we're carrying on. So in Madagascar, they're using Artemisia annua. Good idea. It's an old anti-malarial, just like the hydroxychloroquine, the Plaquenil. The Asian scientist won a Nobel Prize just for her work with this. I mean, yeah, there needs to be more investigation, but they have figured out that this is going to work with their population, and it'll be interesting to see as the statistics unfold. And of course, Cuba, which has helped developing countries for many, many years, and their medical system is just so well known around the world for this small little country and what it's been able to do and accomplish. And they have their own alpha interferon, which they have been using. And again, I haven't had time to research these things, but I think they bear interest, right? And then let's think about our future, because on a public health level, one of the big things is, this quarantines are lifting, but I still don't think there's adequate testing. I purchase all these test kits to use with my clients. I've probably done 10 and like nothing's positive, and I can't believe it relative to their clinical presentation. So I think it would be more significant if I was getting positive readings, but just all the negative readings, I don't think we can trust, because clinically we see what's going on. So that's an issue, right? But the testing piece has to be solved. Then there's this acronym, forgot who developed it, but it's called POSWIT. Purpose of the system is what it does. And clearly we are in a system that is unraveling, right? The virus is unraveling, even going beyond what I think it was designed for. But time will tell, especially with this quote-unquote second wave in the United States, whether that's going to happen or not, because the virus is also mutating in people. And, you're seeing more now of different vascular problems with younger people, but who knows what's next? So the virus is definitely doing what it's programmed to do, and it wants to live. And we're going to have to figure out how to make peace with it. And of course, as I mentioned, the race to vaccine and the questions about, the mandatory nature of it, whether they're actually going to work. I mean, people are told to take the flu vaccine every year, but yet, 25% effectiveness? I mean, in a military study that was done, it was shown that there was a 36% increased chance of getting this COVID-19 if the military personnel had a flu shot. That's a problem. We need to better understand what all of these vaccine loading, what that actually does to the immune system. So these two pictures, on the left you have gentlemen that are not maintaining social distance. So what does that mean? And are they really, how much are they actually doing here? And is this what the future is going to look like? And of course, my big concern is on the right. As a sports fan, what is going to happen to all of my sports? What's going to happen to entertainment? I mean, and I bring these up because these are major areas of human endeavor. People have put their lives into these areas, and the future of it is all in question. And just coming back to the fact that it's going to be, I guess, a couple of weeks now on June 3rd, I'm going to dig in with a webinar to really look more at therapeutics as things evolve. With Trump taking hydroxychloroquine, I think that's going to lead to, it's just going to lead to a lot more questions and hopefully more serious investigation about the proper use of that medication. In the webinar, I really want to explore some homeopathic alternatives to turn people on to the idea of different pictures of illness, different presentations of it, in the same way that if you're a parent, you know how your child gets sick. If you're an adult, you know how you get sick. It's a particular pattern and presentation. Guess what? There are homeopathic remedies that can actually nip that in the bud. And again, homeopathy has proven to be very effective over the years in dealing with any number of epidemics. And I put the lyrics for one of Jamie Lula's songs. We are the one we've been waiting for. We are the love that we seek. We are the seeds we've been sowing. We are the harvest we reap. I just think that's so well said. And we really have to understand that we are all, the consciousness of everybody must really raise to another level so that we can all answer this call. So that we can answer this call, so we can harvest the seeds that really ensure us for a future, right? So I think my last slide here, from webinar to community, because the virus is about change, it's about transformation, and it's telling people you have to change. It's just like if you get a diagnosis of cancer, yeah, you get help, but you have to change. There's something you're doing that you have to correct. And we all need to be about sharing our gifts. During this time of quarantine, I've watched so many different webinars and just, felt the human spark of intelligence and genius is just circulating that needs to come to the surface as we become more inventive and creative, looking at solutions that can improve our lives and help us to be more in harmony with the planet and the other kingdoms, the other life forms that are all expressing the same life energy, that we have to do this together. So I hope in presenting this information that it empowers you not only to help yourself, but to look for solutions in whatever area of life that you're in, and understand that you do have the answers inside of you, and you really can sit and be quiet and ask for help and be guided to the sources that you need for help. So with that, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope some of you can make the webinar on June 3rd. You can check out kokaiom.com for more details. And everybody, just peace and blessings, and take care.